Welcome to my channel. My name is Reese, and today I'm going to talk to you about a subgenre type of book, category of book that I have been loving lately, and truthfully have always really loved. I'm calling it Women in Literary-Leaning Post-Apocalyptic Scenarios. And that basically means a badass woman who is surviving in a world that has had some sort of disaster, post-apocalyptic thing happen. It's also a little bit of women versus the void to me, because most of these stories, most of these books are more on the existential side versus the fantasy, sci-fi, epic side, but you'll see throughout the recommendations that there is a bit of a spectrum there. You could also say this is where dystopian fiction meets literary fiction. Why am I even talking about this, you might be asking? Well, sometimes you want to read a book where you're just able to escape the horrors of the world and reality around you. But other times you might want to read a book where you are faced with some scary existential stuff, because that makes you feel a little less alone about all the scary existential stuff that you are facing in your everyday life. And I'm definitely in the latter category of that. And so today I will be sharing some book recommendations that fall into that. So stick around. First of all, I love this type of genre, subcategory, whatever you want to call it. One of my first big novel ideas was in this category. The idea came to me when I was on a trip in Palm Springs, a desert, desolate, dry, arid environment. And I spent a good few weeks writing a outline of that, but I wasn't quite yet ready to dive into that story. And so I have an outline, I have an idea of where that story might go, but I'm definitely not ready to finish that. So that's gonna sit around one day for me to be able to dive back into that. Maybe more on that later, we'll see. For now, let's get into my recommendations for you. Kicking things off with the book that inspired this video, I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This is the story of 40 women who have been held captive underground against their will until one day something happens and they escape. And the story is told through the perspective of the youngest prisoner, who has basically spent her whole life underground, and what they find above ground when they escape is perhaps even more mysterious than their situation when they were being held captive. I loved this book. I will probably reread this book once a year. It was that impactful to me. It was short, I think it's like 150 pages, a very quick read. I think it balanced character and plot really well for me, but it definitely tips over more into the character side of things, because it's pretty existential, as I said. It deals with themes like community, consumption, and ultimately what it means to be a woman, what it means to be human. Yeah, pretty existential if that's your thing. Apparently it's my thing. Something that was compelling to me about this book was the idea of time. The narrator, who's actually nameless, I think, she keeps time for the group in two ways. The first is just how she grows from young teen to adult, and the group watches her grow. And then also she keeps time by counting her heartbeats. And so they have this both quick and long description and keeper of time. I thought that was interesting, especially considering the idea of aging, which comes up in this book, and that's probably why I'll one of many reasons why I will read this every year to see how my perspective changes around this book. Also, as a writer, I found the end of this book particularly compelling. This isn't a spoiler or anything, but at the end of the book, the narrator considers how writer and reader mingle together when a reader reads something that a writer has written, and how those words can change a reader. And I thought that was pretty powerful in that moment, especially considering what's happening. Why do we write anyways, really? Just a great work of feminist speculative literature. 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10. Read it and tell me what you thought. Next book is The Wall by Marlen Haushofer, which I believe I'm hopefully saying that correctly. This book came to mind immediately while I was reading I Who Have Never Known Men. If that book is quiet, this book is much quieter. This book tells the story of a woman who is on a hunting trip in the Austrian mountains, who wakes up one day and finds herself completely separated, isolated from the rest of the world and the rest of her hunting party by an invisible wall. This book made me want to go into nature, live in the middle of nowhere in the woods, watch the time passing by the changing of leaves, different crops that come into season, instead of perhaps when my podcast ads start turning towards holiday sales, Also, this cover, so striking, definitely feels like my experience reading this book. 10 out of 10, you can judge it by this cover. Perfect. And confession time, I have actually not finished reading this book. I have about 30 pages left, and I am committing to reading those 30 pages by the end of this year. That's an important goal for me. I'm gonna do it. I read most of this book while I was on a solo train trip, a couple hours each way, and that supported the reading experience for sure. So I perhaps need to book another train trip to finish this. Oh, and if you want a post-apocalyptic train recommendation, I would suggest watching the movie Snowpiercer or reading the graphic novels, plural perhaps, that it's based off of. The movie, at least, is definitely more action, dirty, dystopian vibes than the book. The book is a lot quieter, but we're talking about trains, we're talking about post-apocalyptic scenarios, so I had to share. Our next book recommendation is Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. You might be familiar with his works, the Southern Reach series, including Annihilation, but I have not read all of those books, and I have read this one, and I can say it's a wild and post-apocalyptic ride. It's set in a post-apocalyptic cityscape overrun by experiments from a defunct biotech firm, which I believe is just called The Company, capital C. And in this world, we follow the main character, Rachel, who scavenges to survive in this world, and she interacts with all of these experiments who are part animal, part machine, part plant, definitely all weird. There's a theme of motherhood in this book, but not in the way that you would probably expect from a different book. I also found myself thinking about the environment and the fragility of the environment. You can't help but think about that when you're in this world. If you're looking for something a little less quiet than the other two books I mentioned and a little more weird, this is a book that you might want to try out. And if you've seen the show Scavenger's Reign, you might like this book, and vice versa, both dealing with bizarre creatures in an unfamiliar, weird landscape. And we're officially halfway through, with my next recommendation being Gold Fame Citrus by Claire Vaye Watkins. I started reading this book last year. I think I got maybe like 40 pages in, but life, work, everything got in the way and I had to stop. And when I went to pick it up again, I needed to restart it. And so it got chucked to the bottom of my TBR pile. But that is not an indication of the quality because I actually really enjoyed my reading experience of this book. I just wasn't in the right place and it wasn't the right time. This is the story of a woman named Luz and her companion who are in a post-apocalyptic drought-stricken California in search of water. From what I remember about this book, it starts with our main character and her friend living in the California Los Angeles hills in a mansion that's filled with like clothes and all this fancy stuff. And I found that pretty grounded and relatable, maybe because I've lived in LA before, not in a mansion, but I definitely could picture exactly where this was. And yeah, I just felt really grounded and real and kind of comical, honestly, because yeah, it's the end of the world, or the world is drought stricken and you just have a bunch of crap everywhere. So what can you do with all those fancy dresses? I don't know, play dress up. That's kind of what happens. And yeah, I enjoyed that. And that brings me to another point about this book, which is how it's in the subgenre of climate fiction, which I am finding myself being more and more drawn to, probably because it's, I don't know, basically not fiction anymore, terrifying. And we won't get into that today, but yes, read this book if you're interested in that. One other thing that was really compelling to me at the beginning of this book is how the main character is anointed by the Bureau of Conservation as Baby Done. And I'm going to read what that means so it will make more sense. 8 pounds, 8 ounces. The child has been adopted by the Bureau of Conservation, which embarks today on a heroic undertaking that will expand the California aqueduct 100-fold, so that Baby Done and all the children born this day and ever after will inherit a future more secure, more prosperous, and more fertile than their own. We break ground today so that there will be fresh water for drinking, irrigation, and recreation waiting for Baby Done and her children. And that goes how you might expect. It starts off and, it's very hopeful, but it kind of turns dark and twisted in the end, and the media uses it as like a marker of, Baby Done starts kindergarten today without green fields to play in, etc., etc. And I, again, felt like that was super grounded and scary and real, and I don't know, it just stuck with me. I enjoyed that. I will probably restart this one. I don't know about the end, before the end of this year, but definitely early next year. Another great book in this category is Severance by Ling Ma. In this book, a pandemic hits and a woman named Candace is living in New York City, and she is continuing going to her job amidst the world falling apart around her, and eventually she starts a photography blog called NY Ghost, which it's such a time and a place. I lived in New York, and I think this book is set in like 2011 maybe, and I lived in New York during that time, so yeah, it just felt very close to home. If you are wondering why you are going to a job you hate every day, you should probably read this book. And if you are a millennial and that, you should definitely read this book. It is not the same as the TV show Severance on Apple TV, that's a heads up, but that's also a great show, and if you're questioning why you're going to a job you hate, I would recommend that show for its existential type vibes. And yeah, actually one caveat about this book, I had higher hopes for the ending, and I will leave it at that, but if you want to read it and let me know what you thought, let's talk about it. All right, we're at our last book recommendation, and that is Good Morning Midnight by Lily Brooks-Dalton. I read this book a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago, but I remember enjoying both the plot and the prose, and I felt like it fits in this category, so let's talk about it. Though it's slightly different from the others because it tells the story, there's two perspectives in this story. The first is a woman who is an astronaut who is on a spaceship, and she's returning from a long trip, I think like from Jupiter or something, and disaster hits the Earth and we watch her deal with the fallout of that. And then the second perspective is a man who is a researcher in the Arctic Circle, isolated. And so, yeah, technically it's a little different because it's not like mainly about a woman, though some of the other books there's dudes and but anyways, two perspectives in this book. I thought it was a great story of communication, and yeah, it was pretty quiet, and I'm a sucker for anything set in space. So if you combine space and post-apocalyptic scenarios, I'm definitely probably gonna read it at some point. This book felt like if Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, wrote stories about women and stories that were more emotional and introspective and a little less mainstream, perhaps. I don't know how you would say that. Also, speaking of mainstream, this book was made into a Netflix movie called The Midnight Sky, but I read this book and I really enjoyed the book. I watched about 10 minutes of the Netflix movie and I had to turn it off. It was that bad. So I don't know, if you've seen that, you might want to read this. If you haven't seen that and you're interested in this book, read it, and then maybe don't watch the movie because it'll just make you mad. And there you have it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing me out on these women in literary leaning post-apocalyptic scenarios. If you have a recommendation that's something I didn't talk about, share, leave me a comment. I would love to know, and I'll see you in the next video.